Hello friends, it's good to see you again. So we are going to continue to talk about rest. So for those who were over at Mitch and Lauren's last week, we talked about the importance of rest, why it was important that we rest our bodies, but not only just our bodies, that it's also important that we rest spiritually with God, we rest in God, right? And so today we're going to be doing a little bit practicing or kind of just learning what those different activities can look like. What does it mean to rest in God? So for our first activity today, usually I just read the passage to you guys. You guys listen, you look at the words on the screen. Today I'm actually going to ask you to go ahead and get a piece of paper. You can get crayons, markers, pencils, whatever you want. And I know people like to do things a little bit differently, so I'll leave this open-ended as to how you guys want to do this. But while I read, I want you to draw a picture of something. With whatever I'm reading, just draw a picture of what comes to your mind. You could also write down certain words that stand out, maybe for some of the older kids while you're listening to me read. Write down words, ideas, anything that kind of comes to your mind when I'm reading. Sound good? Okay, so once you have that, we'll go ahead and we will look at our passage today. So our passage comes from Hebrews, which right now just says Hebrew. It should say Hebrews. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 5. And this section is called, or titled, A Sabbath Rest for the People of God. So remember, have your drawing utensils, your writing utensils ready as I read this. Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we have also had the good news proclaimed to us just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them, because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed. Now we who have believed enter the rest, just as God has said, so I declared an oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. And yet his words have been finished since the creation of the world. And yet his works have been finished since the creation of the world. For somewhere he has spoken about the seventh day in these words, on the seventh day God rested from all of his works. And again in the passage above he says, they shall never enter my rest. So what kind of picture did you draw? What kind of words stood out as I shared this? You can share that with a sibling or your parents. You can share it with me at kids@eastsideharrisonburg.org. Would love to see what you guys came up with. So what does all of this mean, right? In this passage, it almost sounds like God is angry. He says, so I declared on earth in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. Like we talked about last week, God actually wants us to rest, right? He created us as human beings who needed rest. If he didn't want us to rest, he would create us where we never needed sleep. We never needed downtime. We could just go, and we would never get tired. And as cool as that would be, man, I'm really glad that we can have periods of time where we need to rest, right? So yeah, he is, God wants us to rest. And like I said last week as well, one of the commandments is actually having God say to us, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And so normally we as Christians will look at that as a Sunday. We will look at Sunday and kind of put that with the Sabbath, the day that we go to church, we worship God. And also it's a day that we are encouraged to not do much. We try to not do any work, go to school, do homework, anything like that, right? We're just encouraged to kind of have a down day. And so in verse 2 it says, for we have also heard the good news proclaimed to us just as they did, but the message they heard was no value to them, right? So they, like we talked about before, there was people when Jesus was doing his ministry here on earth where Jesus was proclaiming the good news and people were just like, who is this guy? They didn't really believe that he was the Messiah. So what they said, it kind of went in one ear and then it went out the other. They weren't really listening, right? And so Jesus was always saying, come to me. I will quench your thirst, your hunger. And, we know that he's not physically talking about physical hunger and physical thirst. He's talking about thirst for the Spirit, hunger for the Spirit, right? And so this is also rest, to rest in Him. Okay, so now our next little activity, exercise that we're going to do is I have some pictures here. We have a picture of what looks like a main street, kind of a downtown area. It's kind of small. And then to the right, we have a picture of farmland. And then we have a beautiful beach with a really nice sunset. And then our last picture is of the mountains. So another way that we can rest in God. So our first activity, right, we are drawing pictures, are writing words that stood out to us. We can do this when we read the Bible, right? We can read a little verse or a little section. It doesn't have to be a whole book. But when you do that, you can practice drawing a picture or writing words that stuck out to you, right? That's kind of resting in God. You're listening for God's voice, in your mind of what, He may be trying to tell you. So for this, to start out, what I want you guys to do is to pick kind of one of the areas in this pictures, pretend you're in a small little city, pretend you're in farmland, in the mountains, and the beach. And just for a couple of seconds, I want you to sit down and I want you to close your eyes and we can actually do this together. I'll pick one of these pictures to do as well. We'll do this for a couple of seconds and I want you to almost try as hard as you can to imagine yourself actually in one of these settings. And then if you want to, you can just think about it as well. But if you want to, write down the things that you hear when you have your eyes closed, when you're imagining yourself in one of these settings, okay? So let's go ahead and take a few seconds and to do that, we're just gonna imagine ourselves in one of these places. Okay, we can open our eyes. So I chose one of my favorite spots. A lot of these spots are my favorite, but the one that I chose to pretend that I was at was kind of in the mountains in this secluded wooded area, right? And so some of the things that I imagined myself hearing was maybe a gentle breeze. So the trees were kind of moving, the branches were rubbing together. I heard a couple of birds, which wasn't very hard because there's actually a couple of birds out now that are making some noise. So that wasn't too hard to imagine. I'm also imagining that maybe, just maybe, there's a couple of fish in this big reflection pond that were kind of swimming around. So the water was moving just a little bit, not a lot. And maybe I also heard some scampering. I didn't obviously see anything because my eyes were closed, but of like squirrels, maybe some other small animals, right? So those are kind of the things that I was imagining. And so now we're going to go ahead. So we imagine kind of hearing all these sounds, right? And so this was one way we talked about as well, is just being in nature and listening and appreciating the nature around us that God created. Another thing that we can do is we're going to close our eyes and we're going to think about some, we're just going to think, try to not think about anything in particular. Sorry, I'm like kind of contradicting myself here, but we're going to sit and we're going to try not to think about anything. Okay. And we're going to do this for maybe about 10 seconds. So just try to kind of, everything you're thinking about, just try to keep it out of your mind for the next 10 seconds. Ready? Let's go. Okay. I'm going to open our eyes. So did you think of any words? Did anything come to you? What were you thinking in those 10 seconds? It might seem a little bit short, but for me actually, so I did not do this on purpose, but when I closed my eyes, I actually took a really deep breath and then let it out really slowly. So the word that came to me when we were doing this little meditation exercise was actually breathe. And breathe goes along with rest, right? So when we were running around like crazy, when we were doing all those different exercises last week, remember my heart rate was going up. I was breathing heavily, right? I was like trying to catch my breath. And when we rest, it is such a good opportunity to breathe. And this can even happen in stressful situations for those who are in school. When you have homework, maybe you have a test. I know I never like tests. And so sometimes I get really, really anxious right during a test. And so I'd be like, kind of hyperventilating a little bit, right? And so what a great reminder just to, in those moments, to just to breathe and take a pause and to rest our bodies just for a little bit. So these are 2 different exercises that you guys can do on your own weekly to practice resting in God and just resting our physical bodies and our spiritual bodies. See you guys next week at Brethren Woods.